We have clients and contacts of Insignia on the line. We also have clients and contacts of Martin Alderton, who I will introduce in a couple of minutes' time. We've got members of the IOD. We've got alumni from Common Purpose and a variety of other people who've joined the webinar via LinkedIn and or Twitter. So thank you all for joining us. I was saying to Martin a couple of minutes ago, we've actually had the highest registration levels for this particular webinar of any webinar that we have ever run. So there clearly is understandably massive interest in the topic that we're about to cover. First of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Hemus. I'm the Managing Director of Insignia. We're a crisis management consultancy and we work with leaders of organisations to help them plan, train, rehearse, and sometimes handle the worst days of their lives. And historically, that's been everything from cyber attacks to environmental incidents to product contamination. Clearly, we are facing today together the biggest crisis that anyone has had to grapple with in living memory. And I think the interesting thing is that what I've learned over the years is that whatever the crisis type, ultimately people are at the heart of that crisis. It's the people who are impacted by the crisis that makes it a crisis, and it's the people who are responsible for managing it that will either protect those people who are impacted or else sometimes cause unnecessary suffering, whether that's jobs or whether it's health. At the moment, we are all facing multiple kind of human personal impacts, whether it's as business managers, leaders or owners. We are under tremendous personal pressure, but we're also to an extent responsible for the welfare of our teams, the people that we work with and those that are furloughed, working hard for us, and indeed those who are ill. And so if your role is as a manager or a leader or an owner in business, actually doing everything that you reasonably can to look after your people and also look after yourself is so important. And that's why I was so pleased to be able to invite Martin Alderton to talk with us on this webinar this afternoon. Martin and I have known each other for 5 years or more in various different guises actually, and Martin has some really very, very relevant experience and expertise to share on this call. So maybe Martin, if you could talk about your background, I'll then run through the agenda and then hand over to you to impart that advice.
Sure, thank you very much indeed for the invitation, Jonathan. Yes, I've been doing what I do now for about 20 years. Before that, I was the manager of a community mental health team, reporting to Health and Social Services. I was also the founder and manager of a disaster response team within a local authority in the English West Midlands. And as I left the public sector and moved into the private sector 20 years ago, and since then I've been a busy trauma consultant, if you like, traveling around the world. I've been involved in directly responding to something over 500 incidents now, and I'm the managing consultant of Clarity, Stress and Trauma.
Thanks, Martin. So in terms of what we're going to cover this afternoon, we're really going to look at 3 areas. What you can do proactively to look after your team, what you can do to look after your team reactively, in other words, after something has happened to potentially cause psychological trauma, how you can look after yourself, and then finally, just a reminder of the support that we're offering to help you survive and hopefully prosper through this enormous challenge that everyone is facing. I would encourage you to ask questions via the question option on your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We will deal with as many of those at the end of Martin's discussion as possible. So do please send your questions through. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Martin to talk you through those first 3 areas.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. Yeah, so first of all, let's kind of set the context here. And the trouble is, it's incredibly broad, isn't it? The circumstances that people find themselves in, managing or running or leading businesses, in these very, very strange circumstances. And there will be all sorts of challenges to perhaps having to run and manage a virtual business now. A whole variety of issues, some of which are much more relevant to Jonathan than they are to me. But what I'm here to talk about really is the protection of the psychological welfare of your team and yourself during this pandemic, when people's lives are being affected in so many ways, including the possibility of tragedy. And when it comes to sort of thinking about the kind of things that can happen, I'm going to focus mainly on that. Now, that's obviously not the only thing that can happen. A whole wide variety of things could potentially happen. But we'll think about, one of the worst case scenarios, which is where a death or even the possibility of multiple deaths could occur. Why do this? Well, what we're aiming to do in protecting psychological welfare is firstly reduce distress. Now, of course, if something awful happens, such as, for instance, the death of a close colleague known to you and many of your team maybe, or known to a group of people within your business, of course, people are going to be distressed by that. That's going to be shocking and have all kinds of cause all kinds of reactions. What we want to do, however, is reduce the unnecessary extra distress that can occur if people feel as if this hasn't been properly dealt with, properly responded to, that your organization hasn't shown appropriate care and concern, hasn't shown it's taking it seriously enough, hasn't done what it could have reasonably done in terms of supporting, informing, and helping people. By doing that, by looking after people well, and therefore reducing that unnecessary extra distress, it will help to what? It will help to retain goodwill, really, between employees, for instance, and an employing organization. People want to feel as if they're working for an organization that, even if a terrible thing happens, responds well, looks after them, shows that if such a thing were to happen again, they take it seriously, they want to be caring and concerned. Also, it might be that you not only manage to retain that goodwill, but as a result, perhaps help prevent some of the losses that would otherwise occur in the effectiveness of your business or your organization, whatever it is that you're actually doing. So, okay, breaking this down then. So proactively, what I mean by proactively really is where we are now. So already life is disrupted enough, business life is disrupted enough. Lots of people are not even able to work on their normal premises or whatever site they would ordinarily work on. They're working out of their homes. For some staff are furloughed, others are doing the best they can, operating from a home environment where it really might not be terribly suitable for them to work. So there's all sorts of things going on now, even before, in most cases, even before something particularly unpleasant, traumatic or tragic could occur. So you're already, dealing with difficult situations, as I say, potentially running a virtual business, requiring a whole new skill set for managers and business leaders. And on top of that, here's another bunch of things to need to worry about. My fundamental bit of advice would be communicate. Communicate, communicate, communicate. And in communicating, make a very specific and deliberate attempt to ensure that you're not only communicating about the business, about the tasks to be done, about the jobs, about the things that need to be completed, what's been done, what's got to be done, when we're going to do it, how are we working out what we've got to do next, how are we coping with all of these extra pressures and problems arising out of the social distancing regulations. Clearly, all of those things are important, because if you're part of any organization that is expected to perform, and particularly if it's a commercial organization that has got to somehow keep its financial head above water, then yes, of course, you need to be concerned about all of those things. But just as importantly, communicate about people, how they are personally, how they're managing, what the obstacles to work are. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to come up with an answer to everything. And this is tricky, because if you're a manager or business leader, then it's often the case that you are fixing things for people all the time, every day. No end of issues come up, and you're forever directing people or guiding them or sharing a piece of information that you happen to know because you know how things are done within your business. You're fixing things for people, advising them, if you look on page 12 of the terms and conditions there, you'll find this. If you do this, I think if you speak to such and such, they know how to do it. Oh, I know somebody who's sorted that before. If you look on the website, it'll tell you, whatever. We're constantly guiding people, fixing things for them. And one of the things which I think managers and leaders find so difficult in circumstances like this is you can't just fix a lot of things for people. And if you can't fix something for people, or you're fearful that that's going to be the case, then you might feel that you want to just keep away from the topic. You know, don't bring it up because you don't want to bring something up that you don't have a solution for. Whereas in reality, opening up the possibility of at least acknowledging the conversation, having that empathetic conversation with somebody where, yes, you're both having maybe in some cases similar issues, and the great big Venn diagram of life, you know, the problems you're facing overlap heavily with the problems that they're facing as well. So in doing this, yes, ask them what's going on. How are they? Try, if you can, a little bit to see the current situation through the eyes of the people that you're concerned about. Now, on top of, you know, practical, tricky business issues, I'm thinking of somebody I know at the moment, for instance, who works from his bed, not because he doesn't get out of bed every day, but in his home with 2 small children, that's the quietest place he can go to. He can go to his bedroom, he can close the door, and he can sit on the bed with his laptop on his lap, and that's his working environment. Now, supposing you provided him with that working environment in his office, that would be considered very unsuitable and unreasonable. But that's actually the best he's doing. If he was doing that for a week, that would be a pain. But how long is he going to be doing it for? Don't know. It's going to be months, isn't it? So you know, people have got all kinds of tricky circumstances that they're coping with at the moment. But you've not only got that, you've also got the emotional element. And obviously, where I come from, that's the bit that I'm concerned about. To what extent are people fearful? Well, there's enough background noise going on to cause people to be fearful anyway, even if they don't have a very specific reason to be fearful about somebody, for instance, who's very close to them, or somebody who might be an important colleague or something like that. We hear this drip, drip, drip of information every day. Frightening statistics, the news of even significant people becoming very ill. It doesn't matter whether or not you're a Tory voter or whatever, suddenly discovering that the Prime Minister is in intensive care is quite shocking information to absorb and try and make sense of. And, you know, we hear about maybe the flattening of the curve, but clearly we're a long way from a final resolution. Eventually, maybe a vaccine is going to be the end point for most of us. So communicate not only about the business, how people are coping practically, but also think about the emotional elements. Are people fearful? Do they feel helpless? Fearfulness and helplessness are 2 particularly important and powerful emotions, which is why I'm particularly bringing these up. And if you're able to have the empathy, the ability to be able to see somebody's situation through their eyes to some extent, and you can recognize the potential in their life experience for fearfulness and helplessness, then the reason they're powerful emotions, they have knock-on effects. They are the causative factors, if you like, behind some strong and troublesome reactions that people then have, where they say, I'm thinking negatively a lot of the time. I'm just dwelling upon negative, pessimistic thoughts. Or I've noticed it's affecting me physically as well. I'm achy, I'm tired, my appetite isn't what I would normally have. If I am eating, I'm comfort eating, things like that. I'm feeling restless. It's difficult for me to settle. It's difficult for me to concentrate. All of these kind of knock-on impacts that we have from things that are very unsettling because they generate fear and feelings of helplessness. In some cases, people might even experience a degree of horror. They might be horrified at some of the news that we get, especially if we see images like the inside of intensive care units and how frightening that is to see everybody clothed in their PPE, and to see things like the setting up of temporary mortuaries. Just the thought of such things needing to be done is really quite alarming and in some cases potentially horrifying. Simply asking a colleague, how are you, is a good thing to do. Asking that question doesn't imply that whatever they say, you're going to be able to solve. It's fine. It's fine. In some cases, you might find yourself saying, yeah, me too. And that's all right. That's allowed. And in some cases, when you're particularly worried, you might say, oh, I don't quite know what to do yet, but I'll have a think about that. And who knows, you know, you might be able to come up with something for the next day's meeting or conversation. But just being able to say, how are you? And asking in a way that says, not only have you managed to get that work done in time for the deadline, or do you think you're going to be all right with tomorrow's work, but instead say, how are you doing? Who's at home? Are you all okay? How are you getting on? All sorts of issues. Whether or not somebody has got somebody in their house that has to use shielding measures. whether or not somebody's got somebody in their household who has underlying conditions. These sorts of things can have a big impact on people. I'm not saying that as a consequence, you should say to them, oh, don't worry about work. I'm not suggesting that work is important as well. Of course it is, unless they're furloughed, they need to be working. But just recognizing what the pressures are upon people, to what extent these things feed into fearfulness and helplessness. Remind people of any other welfare services that they have access to. In the modern world, an awful lot of organisations, many of yours I'm sure, have access to, provide access for their staff to some kind of, usually confidential, usually very professional and well-run support organisation. It might be simply that people have a telephone number that they know they can use 24 hours a day in order to speak to somebody in confidence who will hopefully be able to provide them with some sympathetic and helpful advice, or even just listen if that's what's needed, knowing that they can trust that person, that it'll be in confidence. Sometimes people have access to a service that they can go to online and look at information on websites and so on. If you have such a thing available to your colleagues, then it's useful just to remind them that it's there. Doing so doesn't have to be done in a way that says, oh, I think you're having problems. What you probably need is this. You don't need to pathologize by suggesting to people that they are ill, strange, odd, anything like that. Instead, what you're doing is you're normalizing. You're saying, yes, given the circumstances, it's normal, isn't it, that people would be, reacting and affected in all the difficult and troublesome ways that we are, me, you, the rest of our colleagues as well. So remind them of what access they have to services that might be available to them. As I say, sometimes people are afraid of asking about non-work issues because they can't fix everything. We spend our days fixing things, but try not to be frightened of things you can't fix. Your colleagues don't necessarily expect you to be able to sort everything out for them, but what they will often value is you showing an interest in those things, even though they are things that, as I say, you don't necessarily expect them to be able to wave a magic wand over. Whatever you do for communication, don't rely on email alone. Email is a vital and valuable method of communicating between ourselves, our colleagues, our teams, and so on. But whatever other methods you have, use. Telephone, fine, great, good, definitely an improvement on email in so many ways, especially when there is emotion tied up in the communication, of course. It often doesn't come across well at all in email. There's something about email that adds kind of an unintended artificial brusqueness to many of the messages. So whenever there's an emotional content, the communication that's going on, I would say try to keep away from email and use telephone as a minimum. But also, of course, in the modern world, we have so many extra services, Skype, Zoom, House Party, and so on. There are other ways of being able to actually see people face to face, whether it's a group or it's private, it's personal one-to-one conversation you're having with people. And again, valuable opportunity to say, how are you doing? I can see behind you that you're obviously in quite, crowded circumstances. How you just show interest. It doesn't mean you have a solution for everything, but it's great to do that. As I say, goes against the grain a little bit for people who don't want to bring up issues they can't sort out, but it's a good thing to do. Now, are you afraid that your staff aren't working? They're at home, they're not furloughed, they're supposed to be working. This is agonizing, isn't it? Because from the point of view of those staff, anything that they recognize and perceive is a way of trying to check up on whether or not they're actually working during working hours, has the potential to generate bad feeling. You can very, very quickly remove goodwill that it's taken a lot of effort to build up. Now, I'm not saying that means that you shouldn't be doing anything to try and determine whether or not people are actually working. The evidence, for what it's worth, the evidence is that on balance, people working from home tend to work, if anything, a bit more than they would ordinarily do if they were limited to their regular hours in an office. However, the work that they do tends to spread across the day. And whilst that might seem encouraging from a manager's point of view, great, they're getting work done at all sorts of funny times of the day and night. Of course, it's not necessarily a good thing for them. And I would actually encourage people, you and they, to have a point whenever possible that is that demarcation between doing work and finishing work for the day and going and doing something else instead. That's particularly necessary at a time like this, where people are living and working in the same environment, and where therefore that demarcation becomes much, much more fuzzy. But if you're afraid that they are working, try not to overcompensate by being unreasonable. And I know this is tough because you're trying to protect your organization or your business at a time when it might seem that it's mortally threatened by the effects of the pandemic. Be open with people. If you're needing to know, if you're needing to have a methodology for checking that people are actually doing the work they're doing, then fair enough, but discuss that, be open about it, be clear about the way in which you're having to manage that situation, not being able to see people in the office and see what they're doing. Be open with them about it, and beware that if you overcompensate, then you can very, very quickly damage goodwill, cause unnecessary distress, damage the relationship you have with them. Yeah. Jonathan, I'm going to move on to the reactive element.
Okay.
I want to talk about, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So reactively, okay, this could be in response to all sorts of things, including the kind of crises and problems and traumatic incidents, of course, that can occur regardless of the pandemic. But in this particular case, because clearly we're thinking about things which are pandemic related, I have, broadly speaking, in mind the idea that you could tragically suffer the death of one of your team, of one of your colleagues. If you work in a large organization, then obviously the risk is greater. And it could be that the people who are affected by that sad news are a particular department or group, or, within your organization. In smaller teams or groups, it could be everybody that is touched by this. So if you have a tragedy, if you have a death, then of course dealing with that might be even more difficult than it would be in normal circumstances. If somebody suffered a death due to illness, natural causes, a sudden untimely death due to road traffic accidents or something like that. In the current circumstances, we're robbed of being able to do some of the things that you would normally be able to do, including, most importantly, of course, the possibility of attending funerals. Because at the moment, I gather that funerals are attended by only a very small number of people, and in most cases that's going to be few, if any, colleagues at all. So that's incredibly frustrating. I often find myself encouraging organizations to think about how they might carry out their own kind of memorial act if a colleague has passed away, has died. And we encourage them to think about something which is suitable for the individual. And there are occasions, for instance, when instead of doing something as traditional as, planting a tree, they'll have a memorial evening out together and have a bit of a knees up, because they would say that would suit the character of the person who has sadly died. That's the kind of thing they would want us to do. But you can't do anything like that at the moment. Now, you might postpone. You might say, well, when the time comes, we're able to. There are things that we're going to do that are going to be special and in this person's name. But at the moment, it's so frustratingly difficult. There are things you can't ordinarily do. Now, when it comes to, broadly speaking, what you're going to do in response to a very traumatic or possibly tragic event, such as the pandemic-related death of a colleague, I have a simple mnemonic which helps, I hope, as a reminder of some of the things which are important underlying principles. And the mnemonic I have is panic. Now, I'm not actually suggesting that you panic. Of course not, just the opposite. This is an ironic mnemonic. I apologize for the alliteration, although you can probably tell I was secretly quite happy about it. Right, so panic. Okay, what does this spell out as a mnemonic? The first P is prompt. If you're needing, for instance, to communicate with people, if you're needing to break the news, as difficult as that could be, I've just run a course this morning for a group of colleagues who are thinking about needing to do exactly that, the possibility that they could be taking responsibility for breaking the news to a larger group of staff and colleagues. How would they go about doing that? So if you might have to break the news, if you might have to communicate with people, if you might have to somehow acknowledge what has happened, then try to be prompt. One of the things which, quite understandably, and again, I think managers and business leaders would feel attracted to, was they would think, well, hold on, I don't want to be making this call or this contact until I know as much as I could possibly know about what has happened. I want some details, I want some information. I want to be able to answer the questions that the people I speak to are likely to ask me. However, it might be that that information is going to be slow coming. And I would strongly recommend that actually, rather than delaying, that you get in touch with people promptly, even if it is only to say, I'm so sorry to need to tell you, but, and then you tell them the news, and you do it without wasting time, and you have to call a spade a spade. So at times like this, you have to use the real words. You have to say somebody who's dead is dead. You might subsequently go on to use euphemisms. We do, don't we? That's absolutely fine. We refer to people being passed on. If you speak to children, we talk about people having gone to heaven or something of this kind. But when you're breaking the news, you have to ensure that people aren't left in any doubt. So if you're going to do that, it's fine to do that and then discover you can't answer their questions. And to say to people, I wanted to get this news to you quickly. However, I know there's lots more that we all want to know. I'll be doing my best to find out some more information and I'll get back to you with updates. That's fine. So be prompt, don't delay. That's very important. Secondly, being proactive, trying to ensure that as much as possible, the support that people get is proactive. So you contacting people. Now, it's fine that you might say that in between your communications with people, that they're welcome to get in touch with you, of course. You might say, well, look, I'm planning to ring you again early tomorrow morning, but between now and then, if there's an urgent need to do so, don't hesitate to get in touch. That's fine. You can naturally make yourself available or make any other helpful services or colleagues available to the people who might need their advice and support. However, as much as you reasonably can, try and be proactive. It is not, I would strongly recommend, sufficient to make that one initial communication with people if you're communicating a piece of very important news, such as the death of a colleague, and give them that news and then effectively leave it up to them and say, oh, get back to me if you need to. Don't forget there's a helpline service available, there's a welfare service available, you can speak to HR, whatever it might be. No, I would always encourage that you have multiple proactive contacts. So prompt, proactive. The third P of panic is personal. Where you can, and you won't always be able to, but where you can, being a little bit personal. And obviously, often that means just injecting into your conversation, injecting into the things that you say to a colleague, something that recognizes the way in which this might have a personal impact on them. If you were, for instance, able to, you might say something like, you know, I know how you and they, the person who's passed away, how closely you worked together last year on that project, or something of this kind. Or I know that you've both been colleagues here for a long time, or I know that your families are friends with each other, or, you know, whatever it might be. Something that injects a little bit of a personal element that shows that the communication that people are getting from you isn't as if it's a bit of a template where you're just using the same words to everybody, then putting the phone down, picking up the phone and saying the same thing again to the next person. So prompt, proactive, personal. The A is accessibility. And I use the word accessibility here to try and illustrate the idea that as much as possible, you want any support, advice, information that people are going to find helpful to be very easily accessible to them. Now, there are all sorts of obstacles and barriers to people being able to access help. One of the big obstacles and barriers is their perception of how they might be viewed, for instance. There is a stigmatizing element here, where people think, oh, if others knew that I was asking for some help or advice or understanding, they might think that that meant that I was a bit weaker or stranger or odder than other people. What you want instead is for people to feel as if anything that can be done helpfully for them is easily accessible to them. It's not going to be stigmatizing, that wherever possible, support is provided in a proactive way instead of reactively, where they have to always reach out for it. And where information is provided in a way that isn't what I call pathologizing. It doesn't give the impression you think they've got an illness, but is instead normalizing. And that leads us on to the end of my panic, NIC. Normalizing isn't counseling. Now, counseling has become one of those words which is entirely understandable because in one word it somehow encapsulates a broad type of approach to looking after people. It's become one of those overused words. But people offered counseling or told counseling is available, for instance, will often decline because they're worried what that means. Again, it goes back to what I was saying a moment ago about it being stigmatizing. Whereas in reality, what I would suggest you want to do is you want to say, given what's happened, it's perfectly normal and reasonable, isn't it, for people to be upset? Of course it is, because what's happened is sudden and shocking and untimely and irreversible. And for a while, at least, it is going to occupy that person's mind, possibly to the exclusion of all other things, even if they weren't necessarily terribly close to the person who's passed away, or who we've just heard is now on a ventilator in intensive care, or, you know, whose partner has just died, or whatever it might be as a result of the pandemic. So you're showing care and concern, you're showing you're taking this seriously. Panic, prompt, proactive, personal. accessibility, making support and advice easily available. Normalizing isn't counselling, so that's the approach that should be adopted by any kind of welfare service, and I would recommend by yourselves as well. We're always saying to people, try not to call what we do counselling, because it will tend to put people off. Now, the model that helps to encapsulate and achieve all of these principles when something has gone seriously wrong is one that has multiple proactive interventions. And that means by suitable people from within your organization. Resist the temptation to say, oh, given the awful thing that's happened, thank goodness we have this specialist supplier. Whatever that specialist supplier is, it's an EAP or people like us, whoever it might be, we've got them, good, we can back off and leave it to them to look after the colleagues who are affected by this. Now, it is certainly excellent for you to have a specialist service like that available, but it's crucial. It's crucial that you and your senior representatives are also seen to be the face and the voice of your organization at a time where something very serious happens. So try to avoid any temptation to say, okay, well, I've broken the news, so I'm going to back off now and I'm going to leave it to these people to look after you. Your role needs to, if you like, dovetail in with any specialist service if you're making that available to people. But even if you aren't, even if it's in circumstances where there's no particular need to bring that in or you don't happen to have that available, your contact with the people, or the contact from you and other senior members, senior managers perhaps, should be multiple and proactive. So multiple, what does that mean? It means more than one, really. Okay, and it might just be two. It might be you saying, can I give you another call again in a couple of days? Now, it could be that you'd say, well, Martin, I speak to this person regularly anyway, just in the normal course of our work. We speak to people I speak to them on the phone 2 or 3 times a day. We have Skype or Zoom meetings as well. So I'm going to have lots of contacts with them. Yes, you are. That's great. That's fine. And maybe during those contacts, you will take the opportunity to say, and how are you? You know, it's been really shocking, hasn't it? The news we all heard a couple of days ago. That's fine. That's good. I would recommend that. However, more so, even more important, is that there is an occasion when you get in touch, when it is obvious to that person that on this occasion you got in touch for no other reason than because you're aware of what has happened, you're aware how serious it is, you're aware that this person is likely to have been affected by it, and you have taken the time and the trouble to contact them on this occasion just to say, I'm contacting you now because of what happened, because of the shocking news last week about what happened, and I want to just ask how you are now. I'm asking everybody else as well, how are you doing? Something like that. That is an ideal and excellent thing to do. So multiple proactive interventions means to say more than one dedicated intervention, more than one dedicated piece of communication when the primary reason is clearly because of this thing that has happened, whatever the upsetting thing is that has happened. So I strongly recommend doing that. And as I say, if you've got specialist welfare services as well available to people, they should also be in touch on a multiple basis, and they ideally should also be proactive. One thing you might, for instance, do is say to the welfare organisation that rather than awaiting calls from affected staff, you might get permission from staff members that you're particularly concerned about to say, can I ask our welfare organisation to ring you? And that's a very good thing to do. Sometimes you might simply be saying, I'm going to ask them to ring you to describe what they do and explain what they do. Not because you're necessarily going to take that service up instantly, but it would be better for you to be informed, and it would be better for you to have heard from them and heard somebody's voice and to know how it works if you were to ring them in future or something like that. So that's about what I said earlier, the A of panic, accessibility, making it as easy as possible, removing those barriers, removing the obstacles that otherwise might inhibit somebody easily accessing support that they would find helpful. So what else? There are some tough things about tragic situations. One of the tough things is that when you're also dealing with the very tough issues of trying to run a business and keep that business above water in very, very difficult circumstances at the moment, one of the tough things is that you can't really accelerate grieving. And I have on occasions seen this happen where an employing organisation has done lovely things, but they've done them all very quickly. And what has happened is that within a week, for instance, They've done a variety of things. After they, initially broken the news, and then perhaps they've had a welfare organisation come and see people, and then perhaps they've done some sort of memorial event. This has only been a few days. And then maybe they're aware from the family that the funeral has taken place. And then within, 8 to 10 days, the response from the employing organisation is to treat people as if, well, it's all over, it's all done with now, they're all okay now because they've done all the things that they would have expected them to do during a grieving process. But the reality is that our thoughts don't proceed at that pace. They can't be artificially accelerated. And this is agonizing and difficult. And this is one of those circumstances where you have to step back briefly from your business and just be human and say, people are going to be affected by this for a while. And it's not probably a good idea to try and just avoid the subject of how we've all been since, for instance, we heard the tragic news of one of our colleagues dying as a result of COVID-19, or, the partner of an important colleague, for instance. It's something which is going to take a while. And in many ways, I would suggest that if you're going to be helpful and accelerate people's recovery, you'll do so not by avoiding the subject, but by allowing, even after weeks and weeks have gone by, to bring the subject up and to say, how's everybody doing now? The other thing, of course, that we should do in the case of the pandemic is recognize that if we were to get such tragic news about somebody important to us or a part of our business, that what everybody is perfectly aware of is they might not be the only one. Now, if you don't have a large business, you'd be very unfortunate if more than one person were to pass away as a result of COVID-19, but clearly it's possible. And in a way, whether or not it actually were to happen, the mere fact that people know it's possible, and that when this happens, it could feel as if it's quite sudden and out of the blue. People will make those comments that they do when somebody's died. It's no time at all since I last saw them. I remember that last day when we were in the office together and they were so well and healthy, and I didn't know they'd got any underlying conditions. And how can this be happening to somebody who's still, relatively? I thought this was people in their 70s who've got diabetes or something. No, that's not how it's turning out to be. So all that kind of questioning and worrying, it's a natural thing for human beings to generalize. We become more risk aware and we generalize our fears so that we become aware of the possibility of the same thing happening again. So people will begin to worry. They almost find themselves, consciously looking around and thinking, who else would it be were it to happen again? And this is not a horrible or morbid thought. It is a normal thought for people to have. We think, when something serious like this has happened, we think about it. We think about it a lot. We think about it in all sorts of different ways. It's the way that our mind tries to make sense and eventually generate understanding and eventually adapt to this change in our life, which is this person who we didn't think would have this happen to them has died, they're gone, they're not going to come back again. We think about it in all these different ways. And as I say, you can't really accelerate that process. It's going to happen. It's going to take its time. People are going to think about what happened. They're going to have their what if thoughts, which is how it could even have been worse. Sounds very morbid, but that's what we do. They're going to have their if only thoughts. How might this have somehow not turned out so badly? How could it have been avoided? What else should have happened? Some of those thoughts might be critical. We should have had more hand sanitizer in the office. I don't know, whatever it might be. There are all sorts of things that people might focus upon, fall upon as an explanation, something that helps them make sense of what's happened. They'll have thoughts about the consequences of what's happened. What about that poor person's family? How are the rest of us going to manage without them around? They're the only one who knows how to work the photocopier. I don't know, whatever it might be. And another type of thought that we frequently have, however illogical it might seem, is the thought that maybe there's something that I or we ought to have done differently. Maybe there's something I did that I shouldn't have done, or something I didn't do that I should have done. Now, often it's the case that you haven't actually done anything wrong. You haven't done anything malicious or negligent. But in spite of that, it's a very negative, nagging, uncomfortable feeling that we have, a sense of responsibility. And often people will find themselves in their mind going back, leaving no stone unturned, turning every stone to try and work out what's the part that I played in this? What's the thing I should have done or shouldn't have done or should have foreseen or should somehow have known? Usually nothing. But we still worry about it, and it's a very unpleasant thing to be thinking. So we think about what has happened in so many different ways. We think how it relates to ourselves. My first thought when I heard about Boris Johnson, I'm not too selfish to say, was, yes, I'm in the same age category. So you start to relate to the person that this has happened to and think, what's the similarities? Who else do I know who I might care about, who might be in that age category, suddenly the possibility of something bad happening to them starts to feel as if it comes a tiny bit closer. So we become more affected, it disturbs our thinking more, it affects us in other ways. So the thoughts are powerful. The thoughts tend to stay in our mind for a long time to come. Talking about it is helpful for most people rather than avoiding the subject. That's often not particularly helpful. And the thoughts generate strong emotions, physical changes, and changes in our behavior as well. And all of those can be quite troublesome and problematic for a while anyway. So we think about it, we can't accelerate that process as much as it might seem frustrating we want to. Even if you have a strong sense of urgency about the health of your organization and you're worried about, the need to get back to the things that you have to do to keep on the rails. In spite of that, you will still need to acknowledge the big impact of whatever has happened.
Martin,
So,
just in terms of time, we've got probably just over 15 minutes to the end. There are a couple of questions already. Please, anyone else, submit your questions as soon as you like. But yeah, I guess we should, when you've wrapped up this section, probably give at least 10 minutes to looking after ourselves as well as looking after others.
Now we can move on to that now, absolutely. So self-care, and again, not just self-care in the case of something particularly awful having happened, but looking after yourself at this time now, though especially, of course, if something awful happened. So yeah, some basic stuff here, and there is so much information that has been shared, interestingly, since kind of lockdown came in. And all the social distancing measures and all the restrictions upon workplaces, so many of them having to close down and so on, and the people who are not furloughed having to try and work from home in many cases. So there are so much advice that's come in terms of, if you like, systematically and how you structure your time and what you do and so on. I'll leave you to go looking at that if you haven't already done so. But what is important, so I'm going to keep it to a few basic things. First of all, yeah, some structure to your day is a good idea. So I'm looking at this from the point of view of you looking after yourself psychologically. It's for something that is not going to be done in a week or a fortnight, but is going to go on for longer, clearly. Some kind of structure to your days, as we already said, some kind of demarcation between the work part of the day and the not work of the part of the day is a good idea. How might you do that? You might have a bit of specific time where you actually, and this is a good thing to do, is to take a few moments thinking back, not just thinking ahead and worrying about what's to be done, but thinking back to what's been done and been achieved in the day that you've just had. That sometimes can be quite a helpful, satisfying, realistic way of looking at the situation, not just what is natural, which is to be drawn towards thinking about negative, which is to be thinking about the worrying about what's still to be done, what hasn't been done yet, tasks that you haven't yet been able to sort out, things you haven't yet been able to achieve. But instead being able to look back and have a more realistic appraisal and say, what has been done, what have we achieved, what happened today? That's a good thing to do. And then if there are things for tomorrow, then the obvious thing, make some notes, whatever it is, whether it's on your computer calendar, whether it's something you actually do hard copy, make some notes. Once you've actually made some notes, then sometimes that allows your mind to not have to keep on dwelling and thinking about the thing that you would otherwise perhaps be worrying about. So some sort of structure to your days, which obviously includes, when you eat, try not to mess up your day-night sleep habits, which is dead easy to do at the moment. With even children that aren't having to get up to get to a school bus or anything like that. Anything that gives you that structure is a good idea. But again, looking at the kind of psychological welfare of you. One element of that, just to add to that, is this weekend. This weekend is Easter weekend. Tomorrow is Good Friday. For an awful lot of people, tomorrow is going to feel the same as today has. I would suggest, if possible, if your business can possibly manage it, then try to treat this coming bank holiday weekend as a bank holiday weekend where you do things that are different. Clearly, you're going to think about work. You may do some work-related things, but try to make sure that there is some kind of difference, some demarcation again between times when friends and family might expect to hear from you or see you if you've got family at home in your household, and work. A lot of your work contacts aren't going to make themselves available over Easter weekend anyway. So that may be helpful. What else? Exercise. Yes, you will all have heard of this stuff before. Exercise is vital, whether it's just you going out for a walk during during the restrictions for an hour or something like that. Whatever you do, a bit of exercise is a good idea, and it helps sleep as well. Not vigorous exercise in the last 2 or 3 hours before you go to sleep, but at some stage during the day, it's a good idea. Relaxation. Now, especially when you're facing tough times, especially if something particularly difficult has happened, it might be very, very hard for you to find, a little bit of time where you actually ease your mind and ease your body in the way that relaxation does. Ordinarily, when I ask people what they do to relax, they say the obvious things. So, I watch a bit of TV, I read a book, I listen to some music. That's absolutely fine. When those things are working for you, that's great. You don't have to do anything fancy or technical. But when our mind is full of worrying thoughts, we tend to find that doing those things doesn't help very much. You're staring at the TV, but actually your mind is miles away, worrying. You've got music going on in the background, whilst in your mind, you're just worrying. You have to find something that actually distracts you away from those worrying thoughts. Doing something a little bit more structured starts to become necessary if you're going to be able to spend even just a few minutes relaxing, where your mind is eased away from those negative thoughts, and your body as well has an opportunity to ease a bit of that muscular tension that causes aching and discomfort and interferes with sleep and all those sorts of things. There are all sorts of things you can do. The simple method I advocate is a slow breathing technique, and I've recently done a video that describes and demonstrates that as well. So be realistic also about what you can achieve. Okay, now there are some people who are using this opportunity as a springboard to be able to learn new things, generate new initiatives, come up with great new ideas, come up with new products, do all sorts of things. There are others for whom the best thing they can do is just try and keep the train on the tracks, just try and keep everything going, just try and ensure that when the time comes that the restrictions are lifted, that you still have a business there. And that's entirely understandable. Normalize. Nothing you're doing is happening that's unique. Okay, everybody else is either going through a similar situation or has done in the past. That doesn't mean that I'm minimizing or belittling the importance of what you're tackling, but nothing that you are dealing with will be unique. There will always be somebody else out there who's experienced that and perhaps has shared their experience and how they coped with it. Others have been there before and in many ways have found a way to manage it. I'll stop there because, as you say, Jonathan, otherwise we'll risk running out of time. And if we've got any questions, that'd be great.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions before I just go on to the final kind of few summary slides. But the first one is, how do I balance the need to be strong and show leadership and confidence in the future with letting my emotions show to my team?
Right. Okay. I think it is fine to let people know that clearly there is for you an emotional impact of what is either going on now with the disruption, the difficulty that people are suffering, or which could even be worse if you were to have, for instance, tragic news within your business or something like that. It's absolutely fine. The kind of the balance, if you like, is the point at which it becomes not ideal is where those people would then feel as if they need to look after you. You now can't cope, you can't manage. They're censoring what they say for fear of the impact on you. Now, there are all sorts of reasons why something like that could quite legitimately happen. If you were somebody who sadly had suffered, for instance, a bereavement in your own life in the last few months, and then issues of, death and fearfulness and so on were coming up now, and your colleagues were aware of what had happened in your own life, then of course they might well be tiptoeing, around on eggshells, worried about what to say and not say and so on. But in most cases, I would say it's absolutely fine. It's absolutely fine to, shed a tear where that's a relevant thing to do, and to have that conversation, sometimes to preempt that conversation and to actually say to people, I don't know about you, but it's been difficult to get this off my mind. It's been difficult not to carry on thinking about what's happened since I received the news. I've noticed the effects on me. It's probably the same with you, isn't it? And sometimes doing that in the long run is going to create an invaluable bond between you and the other people who've been affected by this. So, as I say, a bit of emotion is a natural and truthful thing. The limit is where it reaches the point where people feel as if they've now got to look after you, or you're not going to be able to be capable of carrying out your basic responsibilities.
Helpful, thank you. Second question. Any thoughts about how a business should use social media in tragic circumstances, and in particular, any guidance that managers should give to other members of the team as to how they should or shouldn't use social media?
Yeah, with caution, I suppose, is the obvious answer there. I think one of the most important things is that very often, if a terrible piece of news reaches an organization, they will quite quickly realize there's a bunch of people who need to know and really who need to be communicated with directly. We do not want those people, if at all humanly possible, to be receiving this news by social media. And we hear examples, don't we? I'm sure this is very much your territory, Jonathan, where we hear awful things like somebody heard they'd been sacked when they saw it on news or something like that.
Yeah.
Somebody heard that, and as you know, great efforts are often made to try and avoid sharing the name of somebody who's died.
Yeah.
Until we know that the next of kin at least has heard the news. It's a case of social media kind of comes in behind those things. Now, that means sometimes, however, you still need to get to it fairly quickly, but you need to get to a point where once you've been able to have more personal, more proactive and prompt communication, you or people on your behalf, suitable people within your organization, have that communication with the people who need to hear from you, who need to know, who need to be shown that this is being taken seriously, who are seeing care and concern being expressed on behalf of the organization. Then behind that might be when the message comes out to say, having suffered this tragedy, all our thoughts are with those who are most closely affected, being cautious at that point about what information is up on your website, whether or not you want to add something, all that kind of stuff. So the answer is, yeah, you can use it, but it's difficult because you're trying to balance needing to not be too slow and tardy, whilst at the same time making sure that you're not being so prompt that it's an inappropriate way of some people receiving the news. So I think that's the balance between who knows, who still needs to know, and what information are we putting out there. And there's often a bit of guidance along the lines of the focus of your message should be the impact on people first, most, second, third, and fourth, and only somewhere down the line do you then make any reference at all to other issues such as environmental impact on the business, price, all that kind of the cost of things. All of that comes way down there. Even if you were, needing to make a statement to shareholders or something like that.
Just a quick, yes, I agree with all of that. Quick comment on employees using social media themselves to pay tribute to the person, for example. I think my observations on that would be that is the reality these days, that often happens, as you will have seen in tragic circumstances, that people are honoured on Facebook or other social media channels. And I don't think, even if one felt it was a good idea, it's appropriate or possible to stop colleagues doing that. I think what you can legitimately do is request that anything that your team says in public and in particular on social media is appropriately sensitive and is respectful of the person's closer family. And I think, if the Facebook tribute page is directly linked to the organisation, I think you probably should monitor that and look at it, and in no way seek to police it or control it. But I do think you should be, advising and helping people to be sensitive, appropriate, and not inflammatory in any way in what they're posting. So I think tone of voice in terms of how you counsel employees on that very sensitive subject would be important. We've got one more question, Martin, then I think we should kind of go to the summary slide. So it is, I've recently seen something going around the internet that says you are not working from home, you are trying to work from home during a crisis. As professionals in crisis management, what do you think of that statement? And is there a way managers can communicate something like this to employees while not setting the precedent that not accomplishing any work from home is okay as well? How do you strike a balance without being insensitive?
Yeah, I think it's about having that conversation about obstacles. Now you've been trying to work from home for a few days. How is it going? What are the issues? What are the problems? Have you found a suitable space? Is it difficult? Have you got young children in the household? It's kind of just opening up all of that and sort of doing it in a way that obviously gets the message that we recognize the things that are happening which are interfering with your ability to be as efficient and as effective as you would ordinarily be. Now, it has to be said, of course, that there are some people who would welcome working from home and that will suit them. But even then, I know the research has shown that when that happens and when it works well, it works best when people do still come together on a fairly regular basis and they're sitting in the same room with the other people who are in their teams. And at the moment, that isn't available. So actually, it really is extra difficult, and it doesn't even fit in with the researched attempts at testing out working from home as an efficient or more efficient way of working. So although there were some people for whom this will be fine, lots of people will be finding this very frustrating, it's difficult, and that they are self-critical. There are lots of people who have quite high personal standards and will feel self-critical themselves if they recognize that they're being not as productive or as valuable as they'd ordinarily like to be. I know people who've quite recently started their current job, and at a time when they want to be able to prove themselves, it's made more difficult for them because they're now almost invisible to their boss. So, there are lots of people for whom this is a very difficult situation. And although I'd be a liar if I said nobody is going to swing the lead, there's bound to be somebody who is. For the most part, I genuinely believe that's not the case. Most people are wanting to be still, a valuable colleague. And I know people who are very, very frustrated that because of the pandemic, the thing that they do within their business now has less value and less importance because, I don't know, it might be to do with, particular retail practices, which are now irrelevant, for instance. So, yeah, it's a real tough one. I would say, yes, that you are showing awareness by asking the questions and being open to it and not pretending that you've got the answers and that therefore, once the person's told you the problems and obstacles they've got, you then say to them, aha, I know what you need to do, bang, 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 there you go, fine, you'll be at 100% efficiency now. But instead acknowledging and saying, yeah, and in some cases saying, yes, me too. And indeed, I think a lot of people now, when they're having informal conversations with colleagues and so on, a lot of it is around the difficulties that they have.
Thank you. I just add a couple of things to that. One is, yes, again, just to endorse, in my experience, the vast majority of people in normal times don't swing the lead at home, and I don't think that will change in this situation. The second thing I would say is I believe there is a bigger danger in the long term of cracking down too hard than there is of being seen to be too soft. One of the things we've been saying on all of these webinars is, people will remember how you behave at this time, and that memory will be long lasting. And if you overdo it, maybe with the best of intentions, then your team, if they get the perception that actually this is an organization that doesn't care, that is a view that you don't want to live long in your team's memories. So we know there are some practical challenges, technological challenges. People's workspace isn't as ideal as it might be. So the other thing I would say is take some soundings from some people within the business that you really trust. Get their view on, is what I am saying to the team, does that seem to be hitting the right balance? Because when it's you saying it and you're a manager, again, you're not in the shoes of the people receiving that, but there will be people in your organization that you can trust to give you feedback on, am I getting the balance right? Okay, I'd just like to go into the summary slides, but before doing that, again, Martin, thank you so much for sharing all of your experience and wisdom. We've got your details up on the screen now. I know you'd be delighted to pick up with people subsequently with any questions we didn't get to. And I'd also say, Martin is a fantastic consultant in this area. And if anyone would like, longer conversations, again, I'm sure Martin would be pleased to help with that. And do look at the videos that he's putting out at them, because they're really great content as well.
Thank
you. You're welcome. Again, just to remind people what we're doing, these webinars are happening on a weekly basis. Today, Thursday, because a number of people are off tomorrow. Next week, it will revert to a Friday. You'll also be getting your weekly email update in the first half of next week around what we're seeing in terms of what organisations are doing to respond to coronavirus, what's working, what's not working. I am available and my team is available to you as a sounding board if you're grappling with difficult decisions at the moment on a no-fee basis. We're very happy to have 15 to 20-minute conversations to try and help you through any tricky challenges that you are grappling with. Do also take a look at the COVID-19 Business Continuity Network, Business Resilience Network. There's some really good advice on there about things like managing virtual teams, something we're not always used to, as well as crisis management and business continuity advice. Do contact me if there's any way in which I can help. I guess my final comments would be, for many of us, we are heading into a longer than usual holiday weekend. Certainly in the UK, the weather is looking good. It won't be the bank holiday weekend that we would have had, but based on Martin's advice, do take some opportunities to recharge your batteries. Do look after your families, look after your friends, look after your neighbours, but do remember to look after yourself as well. So thank you so much for joining us on this session. We will be sending round a recording of the event subsequently, and I very much look forward to speaking with you again next week. Have a really good weekend. Thank you.